All right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the second Salkehatchie Scholarly Research Forum for the fall 2020 semester. My name is Dr. Justin Mogilski, and I will be introducing someone who is very special to me, myself. I will be the speaker for this evening. My talk is entitled Quantifying Sexual Ethics, Developing a Measure to Assess How Consensual Non-monogamy Prevents Interpersonal Conflict Within Multi-Partner Romantic Relationships. I want to give you a little bit about my background before I begin. I received my PhD in evolutionary psychology in 2017 from Oakland University. I am currently assistant professor of psychology at the University of South Carolina, Salkehatchie. I have published over 20 journal articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia entries within the field of evolutionary psychology. My research seeks to reveal the adapted logic by which humans form, maintain, and dissolve interpersonal relationships. My current program of research examines conflict resolution within consensually non-monogamous or CNM romantic relationships, how sexual conflict shapes moral decision-making, and individual differences in predatory relationship behaviors. I currently lead an international team of sexuality and relationship researchers studying CNM relationship maintenance strategies in over 10 countries. I am an active reviewer for several prominent journals, including Evolution and Human Behavior, Human Nature, and Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin. And I'm on the editorial boards of Archives of Sexual Behavior and Frontiers in Psychology. Without further ado, I give you myself. Thank you, Me. That was a beautiful introduction. Okay. For this presentation, what I'd first like you to imagine is that you are currently in a romantic relationship. Some of you may have to try harder to imagine this than others. And you and your partner, for one reason or another, decide to open your relationship. What does this mean? Well, this is a type of consensual non-monogamy, meaning that you and your partner agree to form romantically or sexually intimate relationships with other people, that is, extra pair partners, people outside of your immediate pair bond. Open relationships are one type of consensual non-monogamy, but there are other types that you may have heard of that you're familiar with, including swinging, in which two couples usually get together to trade partners, polyamory, where multiple individuals form intimate, romantic, often deep attachments to one another. And then I would argue also friends with benefits, such that if you are with someone and you agree to have sex together, but there is not necessarily an expectation of continued romance, that would be a type of consensual non-monogamy. Okay, well, imagining this, how would you feel? Would you be excited, delighted, or would you be worried, anxious, or possibly afraid? Well, let's imagine the first. How much would you enjoy this arrangement? That is, I'm asking you, what are the potential benefits to this? Well, if we really dig down into this, there are a few potential candidates. One, and probably most obviously, you'd have access to greater partner variety or quantity. And for some individuals, this is really the reason to seek sexual or romantic involvement outside of a pair bond, is to have access to a variety of partners. Well, you may also be able to explore your sexuality. First off, many people have fantasies of having threesomes or group sex. But another detail involved here that I think we don't give enough thought to generally is that to have more than two people sexually involved with one another implies some amount of same-sex, at least proximity or contact, such that you will have at least possibly two men, two women involved in whatever is happening. So to some degree, you may be able to explore your sexuality or same-sex attraction if you have it. Well, you also receive emotional support, right? More people with whom to process emotion and identify why that emotion occurs, who comfort you, who help you grow. So you have access to more of these types of partners. Many people report that they get the advantage of pooled resources. That is, if you are a unit of more than two people, you can share housing, childcare, money, or other important resources that are easier to acquire and pull together and enjoy if you have more than two people committed to one another. You also have third-party mediation. That is, someone who can provide outside perspective to two opposing parties. Imagine getting into an argument with your significant other, but then you have a third party, a third person there who can say, okay, actually, I think you're wrong, and I also think you're wrong. There may be another solution here. Now, I could also see this backfiring, such that two people could end up teaming up against the third person, so this might also belong in the anxiety category as well. But then also coalitional support, that is, defense and aggression against outside parties in time of need. Coalitionary action really comes down to how many people do you have supporting the thing that you want to accomplish. And when you have multiple romantic or sexual bonds, this makes it easier to form these larger parties. These are some of the potential enjoyments, but perhaps for many people, the initial reaction to opening your relationship, practicing polyamory, swinging, etc., is anxiety. It's worry. It's a consideration of what are the potential costs or threats that this kind of arrangement introduces. We can identify a few things here. One, and probably the most obvious, would be jealousy. That is, you would feel a certain amount of possessiveness over another partner, possibly, and that including a third person may deviate from how much your partner invests in you or spends time with you, or how often they have sex with you compared to someone else. This is related to partner divestment or abandonment. If a partner gets involved with another person, is there some risk that they will spend less time with you and, in an extreme case, abandon you for this other partner? There's also the risk of partner retribution. That is, if one partner is not happy, they may become retributory, or they could potentially become violent, get in conflict with you or your partner. There's always the risk of disease transmission. The idea is if you have more than two bodies interacting with one another, then the chance of bodies spreading sexually transmitted diseases presumably goes up. In a bit, I'll go over some evidence to show that within consensually non-monogamous relationships, you don't tend to see significantly higher rates of disease transmission. And I'll try to tap into perhaps why that happens. Or unfair treatment. That is, maybe you can pool your resources, you can share them evenly, but in reality, there may be an inequitable resource division. Some people may feel used, that some people are benefiting from the arrangement more than they are. In addition to exploring same-sex intimacy, you may have some fear of same-sex intimacy or disgust in response to it. And so this as well could be an anxiety. You could be worried about reputational damage. What will other people think about the fact that I am in a relationship with more than one other person? And then not only reputation with other people, but reputation with yourself. Does it violate your own moral principles? Would you be disappointed in yourself for one reason or another? Well, why do these anxieties exist? I want to focus on this second part of the question. There are certainly many benefits to potentially forming these multiple romantic partnerships, but I think that there is more to be found by digging into some of the anxieties or potential costs or threats. And so a lot of my research recently has been focusing on why these anxieties exist. And the premise that I'm going to build the rest of this presentation on is that dating and mating is competitive. And when you have a competitive endeavor, whatever it happens to be, there will often be conflict. And that conflict will cause anxiety, will cause worry. Okay, well, how is dating and mating competitive? At the basis of everything, attraction, romance, sex, it exists to motivate reproductive behavior. Now, no doubt, humans have taken sex, they've taken romance, and we've used it for our own purposes. We use it for recreation because it's pleasurable. We have sex for connection, to show our love for another person. But sex exists to allow sperm and egg to meet, to combine two sets of gametes and then create an entirely new organism with its own unique permutation of DNA. Now, because the point of sexual reproduction is to create these new versions of individuals, what you see is that as people are choosing their partners, what they will tend to do is they will choose their partners based on attractiveness or their partner quality. We know there's a fairly large body of research showing that what we consider attractive are those traits that indicate some amount of underlying partner quality. That might be physical attractiveness, which tends to predict physical health, or it may be some aspects of personality, their generosity, their kindness, their intelligence, features like this. So some people will be of relatively higher partner quality to the extent that we find some people more attractive than others. And we would want those traits in our potential offspring, our shared children. Well, given that people are of different quality, different attractiveness, what that means is, to some degree, we compete for partner quality. That people will attempt to attract the partner that they are most able to get at any given moment. And everyone will be competing for these partners, which leads to competition. And when you have competition, this ultimately leads to conflict. Now, this conflict that occurs from competition can occur primarily in two ways. With rivals, that is, these are other individuals who are also seeking the same romantic partner as you, and you are in conflict with them. Or you may get in conflict with your partner. And so this would be conflict among partners or within the relationship. Let's take an example to really make this concrete for you. The idea of the concept of infidelity. Infidelity is a very common conflict. And it's a conflict that occurs between partners within a relationship, and it's a conflict that ultimately is born from conflict between people who are seeking the same partner. Well, this is a conflict caused by what I'm going to call multi-partner mating. That is, any situation where you get into a relationship with another person, or more than one, into a relationship with more than one other person. And so defining infidelity, it is courting an extra pair romantic partner while currently within an exclusively single partner relationship. That is, you and your partner, whoever you are with, agree that you will only fall in love with, you will only form these intimate romantic attachments or sexual attachments with one another and no one else. So the explicit relationship agreement is we will not form multi-partner relationships. If you dig into what infidelity predicts within romantic relationships with just contact between people in general, what we see is that infidelity is associated with increased rates of sexual disease transmission, increased rates of psychological distress, such as the development of major depressive disorder, post-traumatic stress, or other types of anxiety disorders. It's also often associated with lower satisfaction, so relationship dissatisfaction and instability. Financial hardship, including many of the economic fallout that can occur from infidelity. And then also family disruption. So again, this is when multi-partner mating occurs within the context of you've agreed that you will not form these relationships outside of your current pair bond. Well, given this conflict that seems to exist, I think there's pretty good evidence that it does exist, then how does consensual non-monogamy work? How do they make multi-partner mating successful? Well, if you look into some of the practices, some of the traditions, the strategies that people within CNM relationships use, They have very well-developed sexual health practices, first and foremost, such that people in C&M relationships often report similar or safer sexual health practices compared to monogamous individuals. And in fact, what seems to be the predictor of disease transmission is not simply having multiple partners, but rather having multiple partners secretively, without a partner's consent. That is, when you are doing these things secretively, you may not be taking the most precaution to prevent disease transmission or pregnancy. There's some evidence to suggest that people in C&M relationships have better communication skills. That is, they tend to communicate about potential conflict. They communicate about their jealousy. They end up sharing more information with their partners than those in monogamous relationships. Now, this is from my understanding of the literature, it is a finding that I am not convinced is super robust. However, I am seeing this be published about more and more. And another thing that can happen that has been observed is in qualitative research where people are interviewed about their experiences, some will report experiencing some improvement in their communication after switching from monogamy to consensual non-monogamy. So there may be something about practicing consensual non-monogamy that leads to improved communication. And then you also see certain amounts of unique need fulfillment and satisfaction within consensually non-monogamous relationships. For example, some people report experiencing diversified need fulfillment. That is, that they can rely on different partners to fulfill different needs that they may have, whether those are intimate or romantic needs, financial or more pragmatic needs, or sexual desire. People report more frequent social opportunities. That is, if you are forming these multiple romantic or sexual bonds with different people, then you will be socializing more. You will know more people. Your social network will be larger. And then also fluid sexual expression. That is, again, exploring some of the perhaps same-sex attraction that if you were within a exclusive pair bond, especially with someone of the opposite sex, you may not have the opportunity to explore. And I think one of the studies that I really love on this topic is one done by David Rodriguez, and where they found that people who score higher on sociosexuality, and this is just a really fancy way of saying you have a relatively greater interest and willingness to engage in casual sex. People who had that interest actually reported greater satisfaction within C&M relationships than those who had lower sociosexuality, who were more restricted, who preferred sex within an established relationship. So the idea here is perhaps to some degree this relationship style works because it is matched to the desires of the people who pursue it. Now, this may make you say, well, okay, maybe the reason they make this work is because they're just weird. There's something unique about them that really sets them apart, and that is not kind of the predominant style for most people. Well, I want to make the note that monogamous and C&M romantic motives actually have considerable overlap. Both people in monogamous and consensually non-monogamous relationships pursue emotional and sexual intimacy and commitment. They look for passionate love, and they want to share their goals with their partners, pursue certain life goals, certain life accomplishments with the partners that they have. They have sex for sexual and relational fulfillment, so it's not just physical, though I will note that in these studies what these authors found was that individuals in C&M relationships tended to report having sex for physical reasons, for pleasure, more often than those in monogamous relationships, but they both did have sex for emotional or intimate reasons as well, to create bonds with their partners. And then they both engage in what are called mate retention behaviors, which is a finding that I contributed to the literature. Mate retention behaviors are these things that we do to ensure that our partner does not leave us. So if your partner is your mate, you want to retain them, you want to keep them. And so you would expect that perhaps you'd see less mate retention in these consensually non-monogamous relationships, but that's not what we see. In fact, they engage in similar rates depending on which partner you're looking at. So within these two studies, we actually found that people within CNM relationships engaged in just as many mate retention behaviors with their primary partners. That is, the partner that they were asked to describe as that they entered in a relationship on the grounds of something like marriage, they live together, they have a number of shared interests and life goals. So individuals who were important to them, they engaged in just as many of these mate retention behaviors as those who were in monogamous relationships. So people are identifying these high-value partners, and they are retaining them more often than others. So here's what I would argue, is that it's not that people in CNM relationships are weird or unique in some way. What differentiates CNM from monogamy is how extra-pair attraction is handled. People experience this attraction to people outside of the relationship. Well, what do you do about it? And what people in CNM relationships often report doing is developing and following guidelines to minimize the harm or unpleasant consequences of multi-partner attraction and mating. They will often sit down and discuss the kinds of potential conflicts that could happen and try to get ahead of them and share their concerns with one another so that they can actually address them rather than hiding them or satisfying them in secret. People in CNM relationships take various steps to manage their jealousy such that you actually see people report less emotional jealousy within CNM relationships than those in monogamous relationships. That is that hot, fiery, I cannot control kind of where my mind is going right now type of jealousy. And then, of course, I also noted that before that people within CNM relationships report some better amount of communication, which would contribute to their ability to handle this conflict. So there seem to be these strategies that help people in CNM relationships deal with those negative consequences of multi-partner mating that you might otherwise see in something like a monogamous exclusive relationship. Well, now here's the $100 question here. What if we could comprehensively identify and then measure the strategies that people use to navigate consensual non-monogamy, to manage its conflicts, and actively reduce the harm, any harm that may be caused by multi-partner mating? And as we identify these strategies, can we identify both the really good stuff, the strategies that work really well, that reduce harm, but also the bad stuff that exacerbates harm, that makes it worse? Well, this is a current direction of research for me and several other collaborators. This is our multi-partner maintenance strategies project, which is a collaboration among 19 plus different international researchers to characterize and quantify the strategies that people pursue to maintain multi-partner relationships and resolve problems that arise within them. Currently, we have researchers from about 10 different countries, including the United States and various states within the United States, Brazil, Lebanon, Norway, Turkey, Romania, Poland, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Chile, Australia, the United Kingdoms, and the Netherlands. And the research aims of this group are twofold. One, we want to identify and we want to measure what are called individual differences in adherence to multi-partner relationship maintenance strategies. That is, can we measure through some psychometrically validated scale the extent to which people engage in certain practices to resolve conflict within their multi-partner relationship? Then, once we can measure these individual differences, can we then assess whether some strategies are more effective, and we're at least temporarily defining this as producing healthier relationship outcomes, than others? So are some strategies more effective than others? Well, how we're doing this is a project that involves several phases. We are currently at the end of phase 1. We'll be moving into phase 2 very shortly, and then there is a third phase as well. In the first phase, our task was very simple. If we're going to be identifying and quantifying these strategies for managing conflict within a multi-partner relationship, then we just need to figure out what those strategies are. So what we did was we put together a survey and we simply asked people who are in these kinds of relationships, how do you make it work? What are the best and the worst strategies for resolving conflict in a CNM relationship? Right now, we have about 750 participants. 60%, these percentages are not going to add up because I'm just kind of roughshotting it from our most recent data. But our sample is approximately 60% people in polyamorous relationships, 20% in open relationships, 10% swingers. We have about 5% of people who are currently monogamous but were previously within a consensually non-monogamous relationship, and then about 10% of people who are single, who currently do not have a partner. So we recruited these individuals and we asked them this question: what are the best and the worst strategies? And what that gives us is a database of answers, a database of what are called ACT nominations. So these are simply these written out reports of these best and these worst strategies. Well, what we can do with this list is then start to construct a measure, a scale of each of these strategies, and then how well people adhere to or actually practice these strategies. And to make this really the best version of the scale that it could possibly be, we're using two strategies to produce the scale. Before we started collecting data, we had registered some pre-project hypothesized strategies. That is, I actually came to the table to my collaborators and I said, I think this is what the scale is going to look like. I think these are the items that ultimately will end up in the scale. Then we collected the ACT nominations, and what this is meant to do is to flesh out those pre-project strategies to make sure that we didn't miss anything and to refine it into our ultimate measure, which right now has a number of names. It has been transforming depending on how the focus of the project has changed, but it is currently called the Multi-Partner Relationship Maintenance Scale. And so it'll measure individual differences in adherence to multi-partner relationship maintenance practices. Okay, once we have this scale, and once we've refined it, which will take a little bit of time. It's an arduous process to make one of these scales and to do it well. Phase 2 will begin, and in this phase, we are going to assess which strategies are effective. Which things that people do within these relationships actually resolve conflict, which are relatively better and which are worse. So does adherence to the best practices produce greater relationship well-being? And does adherence to the worst practices produce greater harm? In this phase 2, how we're going to be validating the scale is we're going to be collecting various waves of data. And we have these very roughly divided into two waves. We have two collections of waves. We have primary waves and we have secondary waves. The primary waves are those that we consider essential to establishing the validity and the construct validity and the reliability of our measure. What we think is that individual differences in adherence to these strategies is going to affect relationship satisfaction. It's going to affect the rate at which people have conflict within their relationships or experience competition. And then this downstream of all that should be that these individuals are having healthier outcomes, that they are experiencing greater well-being. So these are going to be the primary waves. But then we also have secondary waves. We're going to look at various things that we expect will kind of vary with scores on the scale, including moral reasoning. That is, are certain styles of moral reasoning related to how which strategies you endorse within these relationships? Stigma against consensual non-monogamy is quite prevalent, and we'll also be looking at whether adherence to these strategies or really public knowledge about these strategies helps to alleviate stigma. I published a paper this year on life history strategies within consensual non-monogamy, and without belaboring this too much, life history is a theory that describes how organisms allocate energy towards reproduction versus investment in kind of long-term goals. So do you have relatively more offspring versus relatively fewer? Do you have sex at an earlier age versus later? And we found that people within consensually non-monogamous relationships have what are called faster life histories, such that they tend to go through puberty earlier, they tend to have more casual sexual partners, and several other traits related to this kind of accelerated pace of life. We also are going to look at various mate preferences to see whether these are related to types of strategies that people engage in within these relationships. And presumably these strategies should alleviate jealousy and relationship anxiety, and perhaps be related to some degree with emotional regulation. That is, when we resolve conflict, when people kind of take a step back and think about the conflicts that they're having before they act on them, what they're often doing is they're engaging in some amount of emotional regulation. That is, rather than acting on that hot, fiery passion that you feel, take a step back and think about it a little bit first. We're also going to look at parenting, because this is a hot button topic. We have a number of excellent researchers on the team looking at this particular topic, but is consensual non-monogamy something that could help or hinder parenting or child development? This can, I imagine, in many regards, go both ways, and seeing which strategies are best at improving outcomes for parents and for their children, I think is going to be a very important bit of data that we collect. We'll be looking at how people maintain relationships with their exes, because if you are establishing these non-exclusive relationships, presumably there will be less bad blood, fewer hard feelings between ex-partners, such that you can't really cheat on each other, at least not as easily. We'll be looking at social network structures. We have Dr. Tomas David Barrett, who is an excellent is an expert on these particular questions. We'll be looking at mating market dynamics. That is, how do people prioritize certain traits within a partner within these kinds of relationships, and which kinds of partners are more valuable on the mating market. We'll be looking at various aspects of personality, and then also clinical sexual behavior. That is, sexual behavior that for one reason or another may be causing distress to those who engage in it. That's phase 2. That's going to be a fairly long phase. And once we get to phase 3, what we then intend to do is to translate our scale for cross-cultural administration in non-English speaking countries, sexually non-liberal, that is, countries where something like consensual non-monogamy or multi-partner mating may be highly stigmatized, much beyond the degree that you would see in the United States or many Western, especially European societies, and countries that are more traditional. Because what you're going to see is within these societies, people may use different language. They may even use coded language to communicate about multi-partner mating. And so the process of translating this scale for other cultures is I think important, and will likely be a challenge. So, what are our expected outcomes? Clearly, we're going to develop this scale, but what can we do with this scale? This is more for anyone listening who is more of a statistician or people who really like to know how scales are going to end up being used. We can aggregate the responses to produce a sample statistic for any given sample of individuals taking this measure, and then we can test hypotheses about how people handle multi-partner ethical issues within their personal relationships. What we broadly expect is that adherence to certain practices will influence romantic decision-making, relationship well-being, and other interpersonal and social outcomes. And we particularly expect that the best practices are going to alleviate the frequency of violent intrasexual competition, that is, competition between rivals going for the same partner or mate. It'll reduce pathogen susceptibility, disease transmission, etc., partner abandonment, jealous anxiety, and the other conflicts that you tend to see popping up in these multi-partner relationships. We'll then be able to use this sample statistic and these tests to assess whether people are actually successful in reducing the conflict due to multi-partner mating when they follow certain practices. What we can then do is a little bit of diagnostics and intervention. So doing research with this scale is great, but the real proof in the pudding is going to be, can we use this scale to actually change people's lives, to enhance their well-being? Now, maybe this scale will identify those who are already doing a good job, but can we refine it in such a way that you can give advice to people? This could be used for clinical intervention. So we expect that we'll be able to use this measure to troubleshoot interpersonal conflict. For example, within relationship therapy, if we're identifying a comprehensive list of strategies, these are strategies that clinicians, therapists could use in their practice. It can be used for public health intervention. People who, there's fairly good research showing that kind of heightened rates of casual sex, of unrestricted sociosexuality, does seem to be at least associated, correlated, not that it's causal, with a number of kind of community characteristics that you may want to alleviate. And so to some degree, helping people manage multi-partner relationships could lead to an improvement in public health as well. And then of course, using it for basic research in sexual ethics, relationship science, even evolutionary psychological research. I think there are a number of applications to this scale. And then the scale, again, is broadly expected to distinguish relatively safer versus riskier strategies for pursuing romantic non-exclusivity. All right. Sounds cool, huh? I think so. And we'll find out whether it's really cool. The hard part about creating a scale is that you have to make sure that scale works. So will this be cool? I think so. I hope so. But time will tell. We'll see what happens. Before I close this presentation out, I also want to go over a bit of future and complementary work. So one of the anxieties or sources of conflict that I think is really driving kind of fear of, stigma against consensual non-monogamy is the potential for mate switching. And this is an idea that's existed for a while, but has been formalized by David Buss recently in an article. And the idea of mate switching is simply this: leaving one partner for another. Well, if you are in a consensually non-monogamous relationship, this may actually maybe not encourage, but at least make it easier for a person to mate switch. And so a lot of the anxiety that surrounds being in a consensually non-monogamous relationship may be explained by this potential cost, this potential threat of losing a partner. So is mate switching aided by consensual non-monogamy? And I've already collected a little bit of data on this, and the manuscript in which this data will be presented is currently under review. But very briefly, what we do find is actually support for this, that people who are more willing to engage in consensual non-monogamy would actually benefit from mate switching. More on that in a bit. And then I also want to shout out my two research assistants who actually will be presenting a little bit of their data, a little bit of their research on their topics later this semester in the last forum, the student research exhibition, which are, each of them is looking at a different way of examining reasons to condemn CNM. This is another scale. I'm really riding the scale train pretty hard right now. Trying to identify the different reasons that people condemn CNM. That is, why do they disapprove it? Why are they potentially worried about being in this kind of relationship if they are worried? My one research assistant, Miguel Cunningham, he is looking at whether moral decision-making styles, such as moral foundations, utilitarianism or deontology, social dominance orientation, etc., predict condemnation or affinity towards consensual non-monogamy. And then Raven Mitchell, who is looking at to what degree disgust sensitivity, or how easily do you get disgusted by certain things, whether that predicts condemnation or affinity towards consensual non-monogamy. So I'm looking forward to seeing how their data pans out. They're doing very well, and we'll learn more about that later in the semester. All right, that is everything I have. Thank you, everyone, so much. I do want to thank a few people for helping with this research. First of all, of course, my university, the University of South Carolina, Salkehatchie. Wouldn't be possible without them. And specifically, I want to thank the USC Office of the Vice President for Research. This research is funded by an Aspire grant for $15,000. So they are making it a lot easier for me to do this stuff with confidence. Of course, I want to thank my research assistants and, Nigel Cunningham and Raven Mitchell, and of course my collaborators who I've listed here. And I'll keep this up as well as I can because of the way that I'm streaming this right now. I may have to take it down, but you can see the complete list here.